All right, I'd now like to introduce our very own, Marquette University's very own, Cecille Medina-Maldonado, who will be talking to us about Cura Personalis and the psychological analogy of the Trinity in mental health care. Welcome, Cecille.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. I'm actually sitting in the same room with Kathleen right now, so this is pretty delightful. All right, so I'll go ahead and get started here. Over the last half century, Trinitarian theology has received a revival of sorts. Long gone are the days of separating the Trinity in two, the so-called economic or immanent Trinities. While Karl Rahner proposed his axiom on the two Trinities, if you will, Bernard Lonergan and later Robert Doran expounded the four-point hypothesis of the Trinity. In the cases of all these theologians, it was apparent that the Trinity is more than a concept. The Trinity is a personal God who we are called to both imitate and participate in the life of. To be a whole person, to be a person in the fullest sense, that is to imitate and participate in the life of the Trinitarian God most closely. The whole person, not coincidentally, is a key concept in Jesuit Catholic healthcare. Medicine in this context is meant to treat the whole person, Cura Personalis. The whole person, body, mind, and soul, are meant to be cared after. In the cases of various physical illnesses, this is somewhat straightforward. Physical ailments and illnesses require physiological treatment, as well as psychological care. It is effectively standard procedure to provide psychological support services for patients with long-term chronic or palliative care. When approaching a patient in long-term care, or simply a patient requiring only psychological or mental health care, I argue that it is important to remember that the person, the whole person, is called to be an imitation of Trinitarian life. We are called to see Christ in others, and by extension, we are called to see the Trinity in others. What I attempt to do in this work is to understand how the Trinity can be mirrored and imitated in mental health care. What I aim to do in my work is to connect Lonergan and Doran's Trinitarian theology with modern psychotherapy. I believe that the psychological analogy of the Trinity, per Augustine and later Aquinas, and then appropriated by Lonergan and Doran, has a rough counterpart, or perhaps can be illustrated, in the modern psychotherapeutic tool called self-compassion. What I will do to explain this is first to expound the psychological analogy of the Trinity and its relationship with Lonergan and Doran's work. Then I will explain the connection between the modern theologian's work and modern psychology. Finally, I will connect self-compassion to the psychological analogy of the Trinity. I hope to show that the Trinity remains quite relevant in all contexts, particularly healthcare and treating the whole person, especially with the challenge of improving mental health. So let's begin then with Augustine's psychological analogy of the Trinity. It's based in his understanding of human love. Augustine's work is stated thusly and simply: the mind and the knowledge by which it knows itself and the love by which it loves itself. That's the psychological analogy. In his work De Trinitate, Augustine attempted to find an appropriate metaphor or analogy for the Trinity. The divine substance, an analog for the human mind, was one of his most innovative contributions. In Augustine's thought, the mind is the divine substance itself, finding its closest analog in God the Creator. The knowledge by which it knows itself finds its closest analog in God the Son, Jesus. And the love by which it loves itself finds its closest analog in God the Spirit, the Holy Spirit. Of course, being three subsistent relations, they often overlap. Thus, the human being can see themselves in how the Trinitarian relations might operate by observing one's own inner workings. In very simple terms, it's the acknowledgement that I am a subject, I know myself as a subject, and I love myself as a subject. Augustine, and later both Lonergan and Doran, use specific terms to describe the way in which these concepts play out in the human psyche. These terms are memoria, understanding, and will. Memoria is understood as the mind, filled with human memories that shape and color our world. It is, and I quote Doran here, understood precisely as the condition under which the mind is present to itself functioning as the analog for the Divine Father, end quote. Memory, memoria, or memories inform the way we live, provide biases, both helpful and unhelpful, when constructing our human experience. Divine memory, God self, is naturally free of such biases. Understanding is the knowledge of such memories. I am able to understand that I have memories and that I can recall those memories. Will, finally, is love. I will to remember the memories. I will to act upon the memories. I will to understand the memories. I will to act in accordance with the helpful or unhelpful biases within my memories. These three terms, memoria, understanding, and will, cooperate and operate within themselves and independently, just as the relations of the Trinity do. The psychological analogy of the Trinity is one of the pillars by which to construct Bernard Lonergan's contribution to Trinitarian theology. Alongside his own work is what is arguably his magnum opus, Insight. This concept of acknowledgement of self as subject, knowing the self as subject, and loving oneself, and hopefully others as God loves others, as subject, is at the heart of what it means to be an authentic human person. It should surprise no one that this authentic human consciousness is reflected in Lonergan's understanding of the Trinity, particularly with reliance on Augustine's analogy. In terms of human consciousness, the psychological analogy has analogs in the Trinity as the Father as originating love, the Son as a judgment of value expressing that love, and the Spirit as originated loving. This divine love is manifested in judgments of value, which carry out in decisions that are acts of loving. Lonergan and Doran join Augustine's notion of the psychological analogy of the Trinity with Aquinas' contributions in the four-point hypothesis. I quote here at somewhat length. Thus, there is established an analogy for understanding Trinitarian processions that obtains in the supernatural order itself. This analogy joins Augustine in positing memoria as the first step, where memoria is the retrospective appropriation of the condition in which one finds oneself gifted by unconditional love. Memoria and the judgment of value, faith, that follows from it as verbum spirans amorum participate in active spiration. The charity that flows from them participates in passive spiration, end quote. Practically speaking, it is often difficult to understand how to incorporate the inner workings of what might be termed as the immanent Trinity, that is, the Trinity as relations in and of themselves, in our own lives. Though we know we are made in the image and likeness of God, a Trinitarian God no less, the concept of imitating the divine relations, per Doran's understanding, involves quite a bit of grace. More specifically, it requires what Doran terms as sanctifying grace. This is the type of grace that makes one holy. It makes one more like God. While I'm unable to expand on this type of sanctifying grace, how it works and what it means, I do reflect Doran's understanding that sanctifying grace can be found in human experience. One of the ways I'm going to do that is by talking about self-compassion here. So the concept I'd like to explore most closely in relation to love of self within the psychological analogy of the Trinity is the concept of self-compassion, as developed by modern psychotherapist Kristen Neff. Self-compassion, put simply, is a concept that aims to bring kindness to oneself. It is simply compassion directed inward. It encourages sympathy and kindness for oneself, much like compassion for another encourages sympathy and kindness for another. Self-compassion grows out of the need to recognize one's own self-worth in the midst of mental health or psychological crises. Where unhelpful, critical, or distorted thoughts abound, self-compassion aims to curtail the unhelpful stream of negativity towards oneself. It is not self-pity or self-indulgence. It is a concept that works to recognize and value one's own humanity. It is a somewhat standalone concept in psychotherapy, relying on various therapeutic techniques to work its full effectiveness. Self-compassion, as defined by its main creator, Neff, has three main components. First, self-compassion prioritizes self-kindness over self-judgment. Self-kindness, for the purposes of our study, most closely mirrors the understanding that human beings are fallen creatures. Human persons are imperfect and prone to sin. These sins carry us forward despite our best efforts. If we were to engage in Lonerganian terms, we might consider this as the awareness that we have dramatic biases. We have wounds in our psyche that impact our ability to experience the world around us. As Neff defines self-kindness, and I quote her here, self-kindness means that we soothe and comfort ourselves when in pain. It is internally offering ourselves the same support and kindness that we would offer to a dear friend who is suffering, offering a kind ear and a hug instead of criticism and a smack. It also means taking care of ourselves for our long-term benefit, putting ourselves on the priority list, end quote. Again, it's this recognition that we have sin, we have dramatic biases. Rather than ignoring them or berating ourselves for our damaged psyches, we can have compassion on ourselves for being born into the human condition. This is not an endorsement of such trauma, but rather the recognition that the trauma is valid and present, and that it impacts our day-to-day human experiencing. Not only is it recognition of the trauma, but it is the kindness and loving in the face of such trauma. It is perhaps the reminder, a remembrance, memoria, that we are very much loved by God, who is the originator of love. Second, self-compassion is defined by finding common humanity rather than isolation. Again, I quote Neff here. Common humanity involves recognizing that suffering is part of the shared human condition. None of us is unique in suffering. To be human is to accept that pain. Challenge, failure, and misfortune happens to everyone. Every lawyer feels fear and doubt sometimes, and every attorney encounters major obstacles. It's just part of being in the legal profession and being human, end quote. This point aims to recognize that we are not alone in our suffering. For our study again, this most closely mirrors the understanding that human beings are fallen creatures. Human persons are imperfect and prone to sin. While there is no sin for the persons of the Trinity, the very fact that Jesus became incarnate and has shared in our common humanity means there is shared suffering between the triune God and human persons. There is no solitude when there are shared experiences of humanity and suffering, or even of sharing in the divine essence. The Trinity is never truly alone, having relations both among the persons of the Trinity and relations beyond the Trinity poured out in creation. The triune God has community and unity in its very essence. This particular concept, common humanity, helps ground us to judgments of fact. Common humanity allows us to affirm, give them that yes or perhaps no to the insight we have made. Finally, we reach the mindfulness. It is known as the awareness that arises through intentionally attending in an open, caring, and discerning way. Neff and a few co-authors on a paper describe it as, I quote here, it involves a knowing and experiencing of life as it arises and passes away each moment. It is a way of relating to all experience, positive, negative, and neutral, in an open, kind, and receptive manner. This awareness involves freedom from grasping and wanting anything to be different than it is. It simply knows what is truly occurring here and now, allowing us to see the nature of reality clearly and with compassion, without all of our conditioned patterns of perception clouding awareness, end quote. Unsurprisingly, mindfulness fits well into Lonergan's study of human consciousness. Mindfulness is a tremendously useful skill in identifying one's thought patterns. Furthermore, mindfulness can assist the self in understanding oneself, hopefully leading to one to love oneself as a subject. Mindfulness, in fact, I argue, is at the heart of self-compassion. Mindfulness permeates all three pillars of self-compassion. This again is unsurprising, given Lonergan's contributions to the study of human consciousness. Being aware of one's thought patterns and constantly reevaluating them in light of experience, data, and judgments allows one to fully see, where their biases lie or where they fail to act as an authentic human being. Mindfulness, per my understanding, mirrors the way in which the divine relations relate to one another. I connect this with Aquinas' concept of intelligible emanations, and later, both Lonergan and Darwin's development of intelligible emanations in their study of human consciousness. The three intelligible emanations in Aquinas' work are given to human consciousness as follows. The first emanation is what we might know as an insight, an aha moment caused by the data of human experience. The second emanation comes from understanding that one's insight is true. Finally, the third emanation is a judgment of truth. It is an affirmation that truth has been achieved. Upon affirmation of this truth, action may be taken, a decision is made. When applied as mindfulness and self-compassion, it is again tremendously easy to illustrate the pattern of human consciousness that Lonergan laid out in Insight and appropriated to the psychological analogy of the Trinity. What I would like to offer now is an example of an imaginative exercise. I would like to walk you through an example of an exercise in mindfulness with an eye on how the Trinity and self-compassion tie together. This is my attempt to illustrate in social terms what I've been attempting to illustrate in academic terms. I'll be walking through an exercise in self-compassion, noting where I find glimpses of the Trinity as understood through the psychological analogy within the exercise itself. Our exercise for mindfulness and self-compassion begins with remembering something that is causing us pain, stress, anxiety. It may very well be anxiety over a presentation this afternoon. Simply remembering something that causes stress, pain, anxiety, or any unpleasurable emotion will do. As the subject remembers a stressor, the subject ought to observe their thoughts surrounding the stressor, particularly thoughts about themselves as a subject. Perhaps for some of us this weekend, the stressor may have been presenting a paper at this very conference. What kinds of anxieties might a presenter have had before sharing their work here? Perhaps thinking that they are inadequate? What one might know as imposter syndrome in certain academic circles. Again, such a subject might think to themselves, I am woefully inadequate. This is a judgment of the self. It is a judgment that I would say is unkind. Recognizing the unkindness of this judgment allows one to see how that judgment may be a detriment to authentic human experience. If I assert that I am in fact woefully inadequate, then perhaps the feedback I receive on my work will be colored with this unpleasant self-judgment. Perhaps the feedback I receive will be discarded as irrelevant because I am woefully beyond repair. These sorts of thoughts are now arising in the subject's mind in my exercise. This is the first step in mindfulness, to recognize the thoughts as they come. The next step in mindfulness, hearkening back to the concept of common humanity, is to realize that all persons feel inadequate at some point. I recognize as a person of faith that all persons have this primordial wound to their psyche. All persons feel inadequate or doubt their self-worth. The thought that one is inadequate, while potentially unhelpful when it disrupts authentic human experiencing, is not a unique thought in human experience at all. It is an important thought and one shared by many persons, but it is not so unique that it is the cause for isolation. Finally, I turn to mindfulness properly. I observe the thought or feeling of inadequacy. I understand that others feel similarly. Finally, I make a judgment. Am I inadequate? As a person of faith, I, as a human person, am not inadequate. Perhaps my work is. Perhaps my actions are. However, I, as a human person, am not. I remember that I am a creation of God. I can begin the exercise of self-compassion again, perhaps rephrasing my initial thought of I am woefully inadequate to I am concerned that my work is inadequate. This change of thought has reflected my thought process, brought on by a remembrance of my origin, that of divine love. With practice, I can repeat this process with many unhelpful or unpleasant thoughts. Again, this mirrors the concept of the will in the psychological analogy of the Trinity. As I improve the patterns of consciousness by remembering the source of my creation, I improve my overall well-being. This is why we consider this exercise at all. I hope that what I've demonstrated today shows the shadows or glimpses of the Trinity and self-compassion. I believe that finding the Trinity, seeing God in all things, a very Ignatian concept, in such exercises can remind individuals, particularly patients in Catholic healthcare settings, that they are persons made in the Trinitarian image and likeness of God. This activity in self-compassion and mindfulness can be done by anyone for anyone. I hope that if we can remind others that we are all originated in divine triune love and bound for divine triune love, perhaps the compassion that God extends to us can be extended to one another in the healthcare setting. Thank you all.
Thank you for that, Cecille.
Since we're in the same room, I might have to take my own questions here. I'll be my own MC.
Okay.
So I'll gladly field questions. Julie, go ahead.
Oh, okay, fantastic. So first, I have to just begin by saying this is one of the coolest papers I've ever heard in my entire life.
Wow,
like, I just think this is amazing and profound. I'm like so excited right now that I'm worried that in my excitement, what I'm about to say is going to make no sense. So
really
I apologize if that's the case, but this is just really profound and original and creative. This is just really cool. So I'm just really like excited right now to be a part of this. And I just have to say too, your example of, the constant sense of academic inadequacy, I think this is just so apropos. And I want to just thank you and praise you for your vulnerability and courage and bringing that example and lifting it up. Because I think everyone experiences that, but like no one wants to really talk about it and bring full compassion to it, especially as a community. I think that's rare, like what you just did. And I'm just really inspired by it. So thank you. So I have three comments. In the first two comments, I guess there is like a hidden question, but I haven't formulated the question. So I'll just give the first two comments. And then the third point really is a question, I think. So first comment, one thing would be to look at, especially in regard to the first step of self-compassion and memoria, which you talk about as self-kindness and an understanding that we are all fallen human beings and we can have compassion on that. You may want to link it to the dialectic between limitation and transcendence that Father Dorn talks about in theology and the dialectics of history. Because I think one thing that happens, like a misunderstanding of how grace manifests in our life is I think often people want to appropriate their graced identity as I just have to keep doing more and I have to go beyond and I have to overcome all of these problems. And there's some sense too in which like grace is moving us to be self-transcendent, of course. But I also think that there's this moment of grace where it is an acceptance of limitations, like a humble recognition of your dependency on God to overcome problems. So the dialectic of limitation and transcendence might be something to look into. Also, I think at the end of Insight, I could be getting this reference wrong, but I think at the end of Insight, Lonergan talks about the law of development. And part of how we develop through history and through our individual histories is by this humble, genuine recognition that there's actually limitations in terms of like how fast you can go in your development. And I think he links it to wisdom. So that's the first comment. The second comment on, oh man, I'm so concerned this isn't going to make sense. You might want to look at Article 1 of Some Question in Aquinas in terms of whether union is an effect of love. So he talks about love of self, like how does love cause union? So he talks about love of self as okay, so there is union which causes love, and this is substantial union as regards the love with which one loves oneself. So there he's kind of saying the fact that I'm one with myself substantially, that causes some type of solidarity with self, and then I can love myself through that. And this is related to this whole philosophical dialogue of, can you really love yourself? Is self-love real love? Because I'm not other, I'm self. Isn't love between self and other? But then he talks about when love, so that's union causing love. So he's kind of mitigating self-love in a way there. But then he also talks about when I love another, love effectively causes real union because I desire the beloved as a good belonging to myself. And I wonder if one thing that happens with grace is that self-love that is just kind of the mere lame substantial union type of self-love gets elevated into this love of concupiscence, the good concupiscence, where my love for myself effectively creates some type of real union, perhaps, or accentuates real union between me and God. So I wonder if, in participating in God's love for myself and seeing myself as how God sees me, do I kind of elevate the mere lame substantial union self-love into the next level of love? So I realize this is like really sketchy. I just thought about this, and I can give you the article. I was just teaching this to my seminarians like 2 days ago. So I realize that's rough. The last comment, which is a question too, is the whole link to Father Doran's insistence that in participating in these Trinitarian relations, I become individuated and I become my true self. So I wonder if you could just comment on that in terms of how does the self-compassion, which you've so brilliantly lifted up as being a real lived experience of our graced identity, how does self-compassion help us individuate? Does it like come from individuation? Like you already have to be pretty individuated to like enter into these practices? Or does the individuation, do you think, come out of the self-compassion, which is imitating the Trinitarian relations?
I think it's a both and. I mean, I think if I consider it a lot like where you do the DJUE, where you are the, experience, understanding, judging, deciding, where it's kind of a loop, if you will, that the experience, that the decisions you make then inform the experience that goes forward. So for most people, at least in therapeutic contexts, mindfulness at first can be really challenging and really difficult because it's hard to tease out your thoughts. For people berate their thoughts all the time. So my suggestion would be to begin with cognitive behavioral therapy, which changes thought patterns. But I think starting it leads to that individuation, but that perfecting it and making it a habit could possibly lead to that type of transcendence. The more you practice makes perfect, right? So the more practice someone is with something like mindfulness, the next time, like if I berate myself, like I'm a moron for having forgotten something, then my immediate thought is, hold on, I'm not a moron. I forgot something. I'm a fallen human being. Things happen. But that quick thought change takes practice. So it's the same with identifying your patterns of human consciousness.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Thank you so much. Congratulations on a great paper. I actually have to go soon, but I just want to say that this is great. Thank you so much.
Cool. Thanks, Julie. All right. I think I saw Cecilia's name next for a question.
Hi. So I can see what I look like. Thank you for that. It was wonderful. And I really, what touched me about your paper was that you put mindfulness within the concept of spirituality and soul and mind. Would you have any thoughts about the fashionable use of mindfulness in a lot of societies that is appropriated from Buddhism without just as a technique, right? Just as a technique for self-fulfillment that is more indulgent. The kind of the way people have it's sort of lifted, and the whole method of mindfulness is taught as just a process for your own individual self-fulfillment and without any context to spirit, soul, community, which is very rampant in, in a lot of people's desire to be better human beings, let's put it that way nicely, but more becomes a source of self-indulgence. Because I see it happening also in the context of therapies.
Right. Yeah. So I know that mindfulness comes out of Buddhism in a way. And this is why I said I wish I'd had more time to talk about sanctifying grace and human experience, because I know that grace comes from both communal and individual experiences, even if it comes from, other faiths or other, I guess, end goals. I think I follow in the line of Doran here when I try to look for the best in something and then appropriate it to what I think is proper. So when I took classes with Father Doran, I saw him more of a builder. He would take something and then he would look at what was good from it, extract that, and then make it better. So when I look at mindfulness, I do the exact same thing, because I see other people trying to think of it as a transcendent being more than human. But maybe it's because I've been educated in the study of human consciousness that when I found mindfulness, well, I learned mindfulness before I learned insight. But when I learned insight, I thought that's what mindfulness should be. It's observing one's own thought patterns, becoming closer to true authentic humanity, which means being in common humanity with other people, seeing the good in the human, separating my thoughts as pleasant or unpleasant, and then deciding to act upon it sort of in a loop, and then helping others to do the same. So I know that other people might use it in other ways, but I guess this was the purpose of my paper, to show that we can take something that's good, that has good roots, if you will, and plant it elsewhere and see what happens. So I hope that answers your question, Cecilia.
Thank you.
Chris, you're in the same room with me. Would you care to share? Okay, let me mute, and then you can ask.
Yeah, thank you, Cecilia. Maybe I'll follow up on Cecilia's question to you, Cecile. But the idea of, it seems like you're trying to walk a fine line between mindfulness and the Trinitarian relations, and even Ignatian spirituality. I mean, even the title of your talk, Cura Personalis, and bringing in Ignatian spirituality and different things that you mentioned in the talk. And so I guess my question is, like, why you're hesitating to use the word prayer, or to get into Christian contemplation, or to get into, I mean, the deep ideas like the Desert Fathers, who had this very strong notion about like becoming mindful of one's thoughts. And so, I mean, this is a contemporary context, and I guess so, and which then you bring in like this, how to bring it into the mental health care. And so it's like you're trying to walk a fine line between like the secular and the sacred, it seems. And so bring in the secular of mindfulness and have a dialogue with the sacred, or the sanctity of at least the human person. But in some sense, why try to do both, or why can't we bring in the sacred into the secular as opposed to the other way around?
Okay, I think we toggled okay, good. I actually hadn't even thought of that until you said it. So what I want to do now, if I could, I'd probably expand my paper by another 10 pages to just talk about the prayer and the contemplative. Because it started off, I realize now, as an academic study on the Trinity and its connection to mindfulness and psychology. But I think if I had taken it in more of a pastoral lens, it would have been contemplative and prayerful. So I think this might be a 3-parter paper, where the next step would be prayer in action and contemplation in a healthcare setting, especially for Jesuit hospitals, because this is care for the whole person. And whether it's a physical or spirit or psychological illness, this is something we should look at. So I'm going to have to make this a 3-parter. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, I have many sources, so you can tell.
Okay, let's see. I think, Catherine, you have a question?
Yeah, just to premise on what was just said. In my experience, and I'm going to be blunt here, I think Catholics, particularly in my experience, have this need to be able to put religious dialogue into some place before people are ready for it, before when they're ready to just to ignore it or to totally reject the religious domain, whether it's Catholic or not. That's something that people have to work themselves into and to understand. To me, it was an enlightenment that came long after I got into school, because I had been totally turned off to religion early on. And I remember sitting in a classroom thinking, well, this is about religion. Well, that has to come from an end run of a development, not from being imposed on later. And it feels imposed to a lot of people when it comes at first as a religious dialogue. But my other point was the crossover between psychology and philosophy is extremely important distinction to make. I think you're doing absolutely the right thing there. But the definition of love and self-love can be hinged onto the idea that you want what to love someone is to want what's best for them. Mm-hmm. And that's regardless of what you want or what your wants or your desires might be from a lesser field. And so you've got the, well, what is the best? Well, there you enter into subtly, if not overtly, into the issues of philosophy. What is really best for me or for that person? And so that there's your transition, as it were, from the psychology field. Because I think in my experience, we're talking with a lot of students, everything is thought in terms of psychology. Psychology is, because they don't know philosophy. Philosophy is not in their background. They don't know anything about it, or even that they're touching on philosophical issues when they're doing psychology. And so it's really become a overtly psychological venture, which also bleeds into this thinking that what I think is necessarily real, that there's no mediation of my thoughts and what I want and what I think is real with any kind of developmental issue, or that it might not be true. There's a collapse of meaningfulness into the idea of truth, and that's clear definition of insanity when you think of it, that what you think is real is whatever you think is real on principle. I have people in my existence right now who are that way, and it's just very scary. They're very operative and functional, but that's what the basis of their thinking, that what I think is real by virtue of my thinking. And that, I think, is more common than we think. So I think to transcend the idea of philosophical, and I'm not saying we shouldn't talk about religion or bring that in. If it comes up in the students or the patient, as it were, discussion, then it comes up in classroom all the time. Most of us experience that, especially if we're in religious schools. But if it comes up from that field, then I think it's okay. But to impose it on it, or to bring it in all, is too early. It imposes too much on a student to think in those terms when they're not even ready to to think about anything. So anyway, I just wanted to offer that as a response, and I think your introduction from being mindfulness into Lonergan is an absolute genius stroke. So
thank you.
I really appreciate your paper.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah. I think with religion and philosophy, it's harder for me to think about what's best for students, because my journey with these concepts was person of faith, then therapeutic techniques, and then philosophy and theology. So by the time I studied Lonergan with Doran, I already had all these psychological tools at my belt, but I found that Father Doran and Lonergan's thoughts on human consciousness, when I read Insight the first time, I thought, wow, these psychotherapists really could have benefited from this because this is such a supplement to their work. And I see the connections there.
Yeah, because nihilism is really, and relativism is really at the basis of our culture still. And we go back, I mean, I hear Ayn Rand in pretty much everything I hear anymore. I mean, her reductionist view of what humanity is about. It's all over the place in our, especially in the politics that we hear right now. But yes, absolutely, I totally agree with that. Thank you again.
Oh, thank you. Are there any other questions that others might have? Comments or concerns?